gunslinging cowboy facing the end of the Wild West era. A genetically modified soldier fighting against a coalition of genocidal aliens. A silent yet extremely deadly space marine. A survivor of a nuclear holocaust. A bank robber. A psychopathic mass murderer with a rocket launcher in his pants, and no, he is not happy to see you. As someone who has played video games like these ever since I was 2 years old, I can't say I've been imbued with the same bloodlust as these characters coming from popular violent video games. It can also be argued that their appeal comes from the amount of violence that these characters can instill throughout the game in which they star in, and many believe that it is because of said digital violence that there's an abundance of shootings and mass murders in today's society. While there may be a sort of correlation between violence in video games and real-world violence, it is a bit more complicated than one might think. Are violent video games such as Doom solely responsible for the Columbine High School massacre simply because the shooters were fans of the games? Do violent games like Doom really desensitize people from real-world violence? Are video games really the source of all evil that plagues America today? Honestly, I think not. When I was a kid, my father introduced me to Halo Combat Evolved. This game is a first-person shooter, meaning that you saw all the action from the eyes of the character you're controlling. Playing as a genetically modified super soldier in the distant future, I was tasked with halting the efforts of a genocidal alien coalition who wished to eliminate all of humanity. Man, did that make me feel like the coolest little 5-year-old on the face of the planet Earth. Kids' imaginations can run wild, especially when being exposed to something that can pump them up like Halo did for me. I rolled around the house using my tiny fingers as guns to shoot invisible enemies while pretending to be in a firefight. Even as a kid, though, I was smart enough to know that I wouldn't stand a single chance against a small dog, much less an 8-foot-tall alien clad in power armor and futuristic weaponry well beyond our time. I know that many other people who regularly play video games could say the same thing, as more than 90% of US children play some kind of video games. When considering only adolescents ages 12 to 17, that figure rises to 97. It is also highly likely that most, if not at least some, of these adolescent gamers would be playing a game that is definitely not within their intended age range. I know that when I was that old, the hottest games to play were Halo 3, Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, and Battlefield 3. Definitely a far cry from Super Mario Brothers or Pokemon, games that were intended for such young audiences. The point I'm making here is that even though so many of America's youth likely played games that were way above their maturity level, according to the ESRB, they certainly did not grow up to be trained killers constantly thirsting for blood. Children may be impressionable, but they're not stupid. However, that does not exactly dissuade people from their opinions on the matter. Many lay people are concerned that playing violent video games increases aggression, whereas this stance is disputed by others. For instance, a recent representative sample of 2,278 American adults showed that 58% somewhat agreed or strongly agreed that there is a link between playing violent video games and teenagers showing violent behavior, whereas 32% somewhat disagreed or strongly agreed. The remaining 10% were unsure. It thus appears that most people believe that playing violent video games increases aggression, but this stance is questioned by a considerable number of others. At this point, you may be asking yourself, well, there has to be a reason why there's a majority of people that believe in video games causing violence, right? And, well, there is. On April 20th, 1999, beginning at approximately 11:19 a.m., Eric Harris and Dylan Kellyboyd walked into Columbine High School armed to the teeth with firearms and improvised explosive devices in the forms of propane tanks and pipe bombs. After mercilessly ending the lives of 12 students and a teacher and injuring 24 others, the perpetrators both ended their own lives in the school's library, subsequently concluding the massacre. In the aftermath of the slaughter, Eric Harris's journals were found. Among many of his disturbing musings was a quote reading, "I must not be sidetracked by my feelings of sympathy. So I will force myself to believe that everyone is just another monster from Doom." Doom is another first-person shooter that was released in 1993, becoming a wild success due to the nature of its gameplay, in which players take on the role of a lone space marine, fighting off against legions of Hellspawn with a myriad of weapons including chainsaws, machine guns, shotguns, and rocket launchers. All while accompanied by a host of heavy metal songs, different for each level as you rip and tear demonic monsters apart. Believe me, those developers did not skimp out on the details when it came to the enemies you would face. With the level of violence already prevalent in the game, it did not take long for people to immediately put all the blame on the game and its creators, id Software, for claiming that the shooters rehearsed their act while playing the game. As stated by Lori Willis, a researcher on the study of video games and its effect on players, video games have been accused of causing these and other incidents of real-world violence. Supporters of this theory say that violence in video games is worse than in television or movies because the game player actively participates in violent acts during the game. While that is a compelling argument with some substance behind it, as other researchers have come up with studies that directly serve this point, there are also studies showing the complete opposite or showing no real change at all. Sometimes playing violent video games can prove to be helpful, as it can help players blow off steam after a hard day. They contend that the increased levels of aggression that are indicated by some studies do not prove a causal relationship between playing games and violent acts. They theorize that people with aggressive tendencies may be drawn to such games, but that the games did not provoke such tendencies. While the aforementioned shooters were drawn in by the nature and the gameplay of Doom, the game itself was not completely to blame for the massacre. The fact of the matter is that Eric Harris and Dylan Kelboyd were two incredibly disturbed young men in terms of mental issues. Therefore, the issue herein does not lie in violent video games, but in the lack of adequate mental health aid here in the U.S. Ever since World War II, America's mental health system has been drastically falling in quality. Not enough help and medicine for those who truly need it, and not enough people in the field willing to go through and work out problems with those who truly need it. For some reason, it is as if no one can figure out why the system is so incredibly terrible. But we can start somewhere. The real tragedy for the mentally ill and the essence of failure of which the move from asylum to community has been separation of care and treatment. As Grob laments, once again, Americans had dismissed out of hand the experiences of the past, and had yet to define a mental health policy that integrated decent and humane care with access to medical services for severely and chronically mental ill persons. A critical part of treating mental health problems is just a simple dash of compassion and patience. How something as simple as those two concepts can be absent from such a serious issue is honestly bewildering to me. You would think that this was common sense, but America's facilities are completely missed the memo, apparently. Not only that, but it could go pretty pricey as well. Statistics even show that a quarter of the 15.7 million Americans who receive mental health care listed themselves as the main payer for their services. According to one survey that looked at these services from 2005 to 2009, the majority of those who did not seek outpatient treatment had out-of-pocket costs between $100 and $5,000. Obviously, not every mental health patient is going to be able to just pay for treatment out of pocket like that. It's another crucial reason why people like Eric Harris aren't getting the help they needed. If you've seen any of his journal entries, you'll know that something was not right with him. Perhaps it was a cry for help, attention. Whatever the intention, it certainly was not inspired solely by some violent video game. Look, I'm not saying violent video games are completely off the hook here. While they can affect how people can act and can even serve as a catalyst for the type of people who really should not be playing those games, they are not the direct cause of evil like most people say they are. A good point that a good friend of mine made is that there is a slight correlation between violent video games and violence in real life, but that does not automatically mean that it is a causation. Halo didn't mold me into the perfect killing machine from the future, so why blame video games for something that they have nothing to do with? It's like blaming those little Hot Wheels toys cars for every car crash in America. Correlation does not simply mean causation. Regardless, that doesn't mean there isn't a problem to solve here. It's plain and obvious that America's mental health system is lacking the funds and accessibility that mental health patients so desperately need. So rather than putting all the blame on video games for being too violent, how about we do something for America's mental health system? If not for you, then how about for someone you know? Or someone you don't even know? Millions of Americans out there are plagued with an issue that may cost them their lives or the lives of those surrounding them. So please, if not for you or for someone close to you, how about for a stranger out there who's on the brink of making the worst decision of his life? How about we stop another massacre before it happens?